Hello guys, and a very warm welcome to the Bear and Turnip Embroidery channel. In this video, I'm hoping to immerse you into the world of watercolor embroidery through a bit of a classroom format combined with a demonstration at the end. This is a bit different than my usual stitch-along videos where you watch me create a piece from beginning to end with classical music in the background. I am hoping that this video will show you how you can create your own watercolor embroidery. This video is divided into 3 parts. The first part will talk about what watercolor embroideries are. The second will discuss all the materials you will need to create your own piece. And finally, the third part will cover techniques. This watercolor embroidery guide took me a very long time to put together. So if you would please be so kind, show some love by hitting the like and subscribe button. So, what is watercolor embroidery? Watercolor embroidery is combining hand embroidery and watercolor painting to create a piece of art. And this type of art is known as mixed media, which combines 2 different types of medium or materials to create. And my fun fact for you about mixed media is that it was first introduced to the masses by Pablo Picasso back in 1912. Now I'm going to show you some examples of some watercolor embroideries that I have created in the past year, so you can get an idea of the effect that watercolor embroideries can bring to the table. Now, why would you want to introduce watercolor painting into your hand-embroidered pieces? Well, because it creates a very charming effect since the color bleeds out through the fabric. You don't know what you're going to get when you get started because you can only control the paint to a certain degree and you just have to let the natural process flow. The effect of the watercolor is very distinctive and charming, and you can cover a large area for a short period of time. To create a watercolor embroidery, you're going to need watercolors, and I have 2 examples for you. The first one are watercolor tubes. And this is just an everyday set that you could find at a craft shop. Tubes I find are more intense, the colors are brighter, and obviously it's a bit more easy to control because you're controlling the liquid paint. Now the second option I have for you is also a everyday brand. It's not fancy and I got it at the local art store. And these are color cakes. I personally prefer to use the cakes. I find that it uses more water and it gives me a lot more bleeding and less control. But that is an absolute personal preference because you may want to have more control when you are creating your piece. I will show you the examples of both when I am doing a sample and you can see the difference between the 2 paints. But again, it's something you need to experiment with and it's a matter of preference. Now, moving on to fabrics. My favorite type of fabric to use is 100% linen, but any kind of natural fabric would do. Either linen, cotton, or a linen-cotton blend. I think that if you're starting out, you should just find what is in your house and experiment with that. What you want to avoid is anything that's elasticy. Anything that has a stretch to it would be difficult to embroider, especially if you're a beginner. As for the color of the fabric, I would go with something light. You can see that this is a very white piece of fabric and the color pops out quite nicely. This is also a light color fabric but slightly darker and the color pops out less. I would avoid using dark colored fabrics as the color would not show up very well. As for the thickness of the fabric, anything very thin would be a bit difficult to embroider on. So if you are a beginner, I would avoid that. And anything very thick would also be difficult to pull the needle through the fabric. I would look for a medium density fabric. And if you have fabric around the house, I would suggest that you experiment to see which fabric you like. The next items you will need would be embroidery hoops. I have wood ones and bamboo ones, and it really doesn't matter which ones you use because they both will work. Personally, I prefer the wood ones because they are very good quality and they are pretty to look at. However, the downside is that I'm always afraid of staining them with the paint. Other materials that you'll need to complete your watercolor embroidery would be scissors. This is a thread picker, which is completely optional but quite handy. Embroidery floss. I have both DMC and no-name Amazon floss, and to be honest, it really doesn't make a difference which one you use. I have a variety of needles. Needles come in different sizes and it really is a preference. I prefer a long thin needle, but you can prefer a short stubby needle. So I would either use what's around the house to figure out what you're comfortable with, or just buy a variety pack and test out what they have to see what you like. You'll probably need pen and pencils. I have both a mechanical and just a regular pencil and water-soluble pens. This one's from Muji and this one's just a no-name one. As for brushes, 99% of the time I stick with just this one brush. It's a size 6 and I use this for most of my 5-inch embroideries. However, if you're painting a large embroidery and you want to cover more surface area, then a larger brush is obviously going to be a bit more handy. I also have a super tiny brush in case I would like to use anything for small details. But again, if you're just starting out, I would just stick with one brush and go from there. A large bucket of water and a scrap cloth or paper towel are going to be your best friends when you're doing watercolor embroidery painting. You want to have a large bucket of water because you want to make sure that you wash off your brush thoroughly before you move on to the next color, and if your water is tainted, then it's going to affect the color of your canvas. The scrap of paper is wonderful because it lets you test out what the color is going to look like before you apply it onto your linen or cotton, and it also allows you to see how the color is going to spread. Finally, what you're going to need is a pattern and carbon paper. If you don't have carbon paper, don't worry about it because you can trace your pattern through a light box or put it against the window. I personally find that carbon paper is much more convenient and it's pretty easy to come by. The next area we are going to cover is technique. The first area to cover is how much water versus how much paint. The more paint you use, the greater the intensity of the color will be. There'll be less bleeding and you'll have more control. We'll start off using only a little bit of water, and you can see that the color is very intense and there's not very much bleeding. Now we'll just add a little bit more water. The second sample is still pretty intense, so at this point, if you want it even lighter, you can add some water and you can watch it bleed. And if we add even more water, and then finally, if we just decide to add a lot of water, next, I'm going to show you what happens when you add the water first to your fabric. And we'll do the same thing, but let's try blue. I'm going to start with only a little bit of water. And the color is pretty intense and there isn't much movement in terms of bleeding or spreading. Okay, we'll add a little bit more water. And as you can see, the line is thicker than this line. There's less control and the water and paint has spread out. And if we add even more water, the color is much softer as opposed to the more intense, darker one when there's more paint. And then finally, this is what happens when you just tint the water. When I'm experimenting, I personally really like to just wet my surface area. I think it's very cool when you wet the surface area and then you apply the paint, and you can just watch how the paint moves and bleeds. But again, you don't have very much control when you use this effect, so you have to be a bit more fluid with your creative process. So just a friendly recap: the more paint you use, the greater intensity the color will be. There will be less bleeding or spreading of the colors, and thus you'll have more control of where the paint goes on your linen or cotton. The more water you use, the softer the colors are going to be, and it'll have more of a pastel effect. There'll be more bleeding and spreading of the color like this, and you'll have less control of the paint because the paint is going to move where the water takes it. Here's a piece that shows you an example in an area where I use a lot more water to create a pastel and light effect, and an area where I use a lot more paint and less water to have a controlled and more intense effect. One of my favorite parts of watercolor embroidery is watching the watercolors mix and bleed into one another. And again, how much water you add to your paint is going to determine the effect of your piece. I'll start by showing what happens when you use only a little bit of water. The color is very intense, and they just sort of gently bleed into each other, but there's a pretty clear divide. Now if you use more water, the colors are less intense and they bleed in and start mixing with one another. And if you want the divide to be even less obvious, you can always place some water right in the middle where the two colors meet and move your brush around to blend the colors even further. And we'll see what happens when you use a lot of water. This effect is definitely much softer and has much more of a gradient look as opposed to this, where the line of divide is very clear. Let's try the same experiment, but with different colors. Intense yellow with an intense green. As you can see, even with less water, the bleeding and spreading is more prominent than the first example here. And that is why your little trusty paper towel or rag is important, because if you are uncomfortable with placing the paint on your canvas right off the bat, then you have somewhere to experiment on. So you can at least get an idea of what the final outcome is going to be before making a decision onto your canvas. And this is the overall effect when you have colors bleeding into one another. Now, what is the difference between mixing your paints and layering your paints? Mixing is what I've just shown you here, having two colors side by side and watching them blend together. And here is an example of layering. You have one distinct color on the bottom and then another distinct color on top. And this is the secret or distinct key to layering. If you want to see the distinct layer of colors, you must wait for the bottom layer to dry before moving on and painting the top layer. Say you want a layer of dark purple and light purple. I would start off with fabric and applying my light purple color. Now I'm going to wait for a few minutes and let it dry completely. It's been 5 or 10 minutes later and my fabric is completely dry. As you can see, the effect of the watercolor looks quite different than when it was wet. Waiting for that 5 to 10 minutes is sometimes the hardest part about watercolor embroidery, having patience, but it is an absolute must if you want to layer your different watercolors. We are going to go in here with a smaller, finer brush and make the colors more intense so that it would pop up from the bottom layer. Now let's try using a different color for contrast. Let's see what happens when we use a larger brush with more color. So there is more bleeding and the color is less intense. So let's compare layering and mixing in real life. In this embroidery here, I had mixed the different shades of pinks and purples to create the petals. And in this embroidery, I used a layering effect. I put the light color on the bottom and then the darker, more intense color on the top to create the petals. I really enjoy using both techniques. It's like being a child playing with paint. I've picked a pattern that I've already created in the past so that I can show you what the difference between a piece that's been completely hand embroidered compared to a piece that's been hand embroidered and painted with watercolors. I'm going to start this embroidery off with a tube paint because I'm going to begin with the ears and I want a bit more control of the paint. I don't want it to bleed into the white areas of the kitty. And as we had mentioned in the earlier part of the video, we're going to start in the middle and work our way out. You can see that the red is very intense and there isn't much bleeding. So this is the effect that you would get with a tube of watercolor and a little bit of water. Start from the middle and then push your way out to the edge. Now a second area that we would like to have more control over is his bell. We also don't want the color to bleed everywhere for this area of our embroidery. So again, start from the middle and push your way out. Now instead of moving on to paint the area surrounding the bell, I'm going to move on to a different area to give the bell a chance to dry, so when I apply the paint next to it, I prevent it from bleeding into one another, because in this case I don't want the colors to mix. So with the clouds, I generally start off with a lot of water compared to paint, and then I just let it spread. You can really see the difference in intensity when you add a lot of water versus practically no water. This is one of my favorite parts about watercolor embroidery, just watching the colors spread, letting it do its own thing. Now if I want to add a little bit more definition to the clouds, I pick another blue color and just let it bleed on top. I think his little bell has dried sufficiently, so we can move on to the bib for the lucky cat. And start from the middle, move your way out. Right now I'm using the color cakes. The only time I've used the watercolor tubes is with the ears. For the color of the fish, I started with a yellow watercolor and then gradually blended in the green on top. And now I'm going to layer a bit of darker spot over his lighter spot here. There we go. Now, since these are watercolor paints, it means that they are water soluble and that they will come off during the wash. So if you're thinking about creating this as a project, keep in mind that it'll be for decoration only. I know that you can buy some fabric mediums online or in stores that's supposed to set the paint into the fabric, but I'm not quite sure how effective they would be, and it probably isn't going to be a good idea if you're going to paint on a t-shirt that you plan on washing often. The stitch that I am using to do all my outlining is called the back stitch. And basically the back stitch is probably one of the very first stitches that you'll learn when you go into the embroidering world. Here I have for you two completed embroideries using the same pattern. On one side, you have the watercolor effect, and then on the other side, we have the traditional embroidering effect. Both pieces are adorable and they are both fun to create. I hope that you too will try the watercolor embroidery effect. Well, I hope you found this water embroidery guide useful and helpful. As I had mentioned before, I had put a lot of time and effort into it to create it for you. So if you haven't already, please hit the like and subscribe button. If you have any questions at all about embroidery or watercolor embroideries, just stick them in the comment section below and I'd be happy to get back to you. I think that's it for me for today, so hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye!